Her name was Elena, and she had been a patient at the Naval Hospital for 3 weeks. No one knew much about her. The nurses whispered that she was the sole survivor of a shipwreck in the South China Sea, pulled from a life raft by a Filipino fishing boat. She had not spoken a single word since her arrival. Not to the doctors, not to the chaplain, not even to the kind old woman from the Red Cross who brought her coloring books. Her silence was not angry. It was deep, like the ocean she had been rescued from. It was a silence of watching, of waiting. Her eyes, the color of dark honey, would follow a person across the room, but they never asked for help. They never begged. They simply observed. The medical staff had labeled her as a trauma case. Her chart said she was in her late 20s, malnourished, and suffering from severe dehydration and saltwater burns. They treated her physical wounds, the cuts on her hands, the raw skin on her elbows, but no one could treat the locked door inside her mind. The psychiatrist visited twice a week. Elena would look at him, listen to his gentle questions, and then turn her face to the window where the palm trees outside swayed in the tropical breeze. She never wrote notes. She never nodded or shook her head. She was a ghost in a hospital gown. That was when James was called in. James was not a doctor, not in the traditional sense. He was a Navy SEAL medic, a man who had patched up his teammates in the dusty hell of Fallujah, who had pulled bullets from legs while under sniper fire, who had watched men die in his arms and had learned to close his heart to the pain. He was 34 years old, with close-cropped brown hair and the kind of face that had seen too much. His specialty was not just medicine, it was observation. The military sent him to cases where normal methods failed. When a patient would not or could not talk, they sent James. He was a human stethoscope for the soul. He arrived at her room on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying no clipboard, no official forms. He wore plain khakis and a light blue polo shirt. He did not want to look like authority. He knocked softly on the open door and stepped inside. Elena was sitting on the edge of her bed, her legs pulled up to her chest, her dark hair falling over her shoulders like a wet curtain. She did not look at him. She was staring at the wall, at a tiny crack in the plaster that looked like a lightning bolt. James did not say hello. He did not ask how she was feeling. Instead, he pulled the plastic chair from the corner and sat down about 6 feet away from her. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and looked at the same crack in the wall. For 10 full minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of the air conditioning and the soft beep of a heart monitor from the room next door. James had learned long ago that silence was a language. Most people could not speak it. They panicked, they filled the emptiness with useless words. But Elena was fluent in silence. She knew its grammar, its pauses, its hidden meanings. And so did James. After a while, he took out a small notebook and a pen. He wrote something down, then tore the page and placed it on the small table between them. On the paper, he had drawn a simple picture, a stick figure of a person standing on a boat, and another stick figure in the water, waving. Underneath, he had written, "You don't have to talk. Just listen." Elena's eyes flickered to the paper. She read it. Her expression did not change, but James noticed something. Her left hand, which had been resting on her knee, uncurled slightly. The fingers loosened. It was a tiny thing, smaller than a whisper, but to James, it was a shout. He had found the first thread. He began to talk. He told her about a time he had been lost at sea during a training exercise, how the fog had rolled in and he could not see his own hand in front of his face. He told her about the fear, the cold, the way the water seemed to reach up and try to pull him down. He spoke in a low, steady voice, not like a therapist, but like a friend telling a story around a campfire. He did not ask her any questions. He simply offered pieces of himself, like breadcrumbs, hoping she would follow them back to the world of the living. He visited her every day for the next week. Each time, he would sit in the same chair, talk for 20 minutes, and then leave. He never pressured her to respond. He brought her a seashell one day, a smooth white one from the beach outside the hospital. He placed it on her table and said, "This one was empty when I found it, but it still remembers the sound of the ocean." He brought her a single orange from the mess hall and peeled it slowly, placing the slices on a napkin within her reach. By the 5th day, she had eaten the orange. By the 7th day, she had picked up the seashell and held it to her ear. She did not smile, but she did not turn away. The nurses were amazed. "What did you do?" they asked James. "Did she say something?" James shook his head. "She doesn't need to say anything yet," he replied. "She just needs to remember that someone is willing to wait," but James knew that time was not infinite. The hospital administration was already talking about transferring Elena to a long-term psychiatric facility. Her insurance was running out. The shipwreck investigation had been closed. The authorities assumed she was just a traumatized woman with no family, no identity papers, nothing. They had found no passport on her, no driver's license, no phone. The only thing she had been wearing when rescued was a torn life jacket and a man's silver watch, which was now locked in the hospital's safe. The watch did not work. Its hands were frozen at 3:17. No one knew if that was the time of the shipwreck or just when the battery had died. On the 10th day, James decided to change his approach. He had earned a small measure of her trust through his stories and his patience. But patience alone would not break the silence. He needed to see. The medical records showed that Elena had refused all physical exams beyond basic vitals. She would allow a nurse to take her temperature or her blood pressure, but she would not undress. She would not let anyone look at her body. The nurses assumed it was shame, or modesty, or the typical behavior of a trauma victim who felt violated by the world. But James had learned to trust his instincts. And his instincts were screaming that there was more to this. He spoke to the head nurse, a stern woman named Margaret, who had been in the Navy for 22 years. "I need to examine her," James said. "A full skin exam. I need to see every inch of her body." Nurse Margaret raised an eyebrow. "She won't allow it. She fights like a wildcat whenever we try to change her gown." "I know," James said. "That's why I need you to help me. I don't want to force her. I want to ask her." Margaret laughed without humor. "Ask her. She doesn't speak. James, how will she answer?" James held up the small notebook. "She has hands. She can write." That afternoon, James entered Elena's room with Margaret standing respectfully by the door. He sat in his usual chair, but this time his posture was different. He was more serious. He looked Elena straight in the eyes, and he did not look away. "Elena," he said, speaking her name for the first time. Her head lifted slightly. It was the first time he had seen her react to her own name. "I need to examine your body, your skin. I think there is something on your body that you are hiding. I don't know what it is, but I need to see it. I'm not going to touch you unless you say yes. But I'm asking you, will you let me look?" He slid the notebook and a pen across the table. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. Elena stared at the notebook as if it were a snake. Her breathing changed, becoming shallow and fast. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, began to tremble. Margaret took a step forward, ready to intervene, but James held up his hand. Then, Elena reached out. Her fingers hesitated over the pen. She picked it up, her grip awkward, like a child learning to write for the first time. She brought the pen to the paper. She wrote a single word, in shaky, uneven letters. "Why?" James leaned forward. "Because I think someone hurt you. I think they put something on your skin. Something that tells a story you can't say out loud. And I want to help you. But I can't help you if I don't see." She stared at him for a full minute. Her dark honey eyes searched his face for lies, for tricks, for the cold cruelty she had surely seen before. James did not blink. He did not smile. He simply let her look. Slowly, very slowly, she nodded. Then she turned her back to him, pulled the hospital gown down from her left shoulder, and revealed her skin. James felt the room tilt. His breathing stopped. Nurse Margaret gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. From Elena's shoulder blade, curving down her back and disappearing below the gown, was a latticework of scars. But they were not accidental scars. They were not the marks of a fall or a burn. They were deliberate, precise, almost artistic. They formed words. Letters had been cut into her flesh, healed into raised white lines, then cut again and healed again, layer upon layer. The skin was a palimpsest of pain. And the words, written in a language James did not immediately recognize, were arranged in neat, horrifying rows. It was not a random act of violence. It was a document, a message, a confession carved into a living human being. James pulled out his phone and took several photographs. Then he gently replaced her gown and sat back. His hands, the hands that had never shaken while pulling a bullet from a man's chest, were trembling. "I need you to write something for me, Elena," he said, his voice rough. "I need you to write what these words mean." "Can you do that?" She picked up the pen again. This time, her handwriting was steadier. She wrote, he called it his map. Every woman he took, he carved where they were from, where he found them, where he killed them. I am the only one who lived. That night, James did not sleep. He sat in the hospital's small office, typing furiously, cross-referencing the photographs with missing persons databases, with Interpol reports, with every dark corner of the internet he had access to through his military clearance. The language on Elena's back was a mixture of Cyrillic and Greek letters, a code within a code. But the seals had trained him in pattern recognition. By 3:17 in the morning, the same time frozen on the silver watch he had cracked it. Elena was not Elena. Her real name was Anya Volkov, and she was the daughter of a Russian oligarch who had disappeared 3 years ago while sailing in the Mediterranean. Her father had been declared dead. Her mother had committed suicide 6 months later. The world had moved on, but Anya had not been dead. She had been taken by a man the authorities had never connected to her disappearance. A man who was not a pirate, not a terrorist, but a doctor, a surgeon, a psychopath who had worked in some of the finest hospitals in Europe before being fired for unethical practices. James looked at the photographs again. The scars on Anya's back were not just a map of victims. They were also coordinates. The final set of scars, the most recent ones, the ones that were still slightly pink and raw, formed a location. An island. A private island in the Philippines, less than 200 miles from where Anya had been found floating in her life raft. The man was still there. And if the map was correct, there were at least 7 other women still alive on that island. James did not wait for permission. He knew that if he went through official channels, through the slow grinding gears of military bureaucracy, the trail would go cold. The man on the island, the surgeon, the carver, would hear the whispers, pack his bags, and disappear into another country. Another identity, another life. James had seen it happen before. He had chased ghosts across 3 continents. He was not going to let this ghost slip away. He made 2 calls. The first was to his commanding officer, a man named Commander Reyes, who trusted James with the kind of loyalty that only combat could forge. James explained the situation in precise, cold terms: a serial kidnapper, a private island, 7 potential victims, and a survivor who could not speak but whose back was a testament of horror. Commander Reyes listened without interrupting. When James finished, there was a long silence. Then Reyes said, "You have 48 hours. No official support, no backup. If you get caught, we never had this conversation." The second call was to a man named Leo, a former Filipino Marine who had worked with James on a counter-piracy operation 2 years ago. Leo was the kind of man who could get things done without leaving a paper trail. Boats, weapons, false documents, safe houses. Leo had a network that stretched across the archipelago like the roots of a banyan tree. James kept the conversation short. "I need to get to an island south of Palawan. Quiet, no questions. Bring a medical kit and a lot of zip ties." Leo laughed. "You always bring me the best parties, my friend." Within 18 hours, James was on a small fishing trawler, chugging through the dark green waters of the Sulu Sea. The sky was heavy with monsoon clouds, and the rain came down in thick, warm sheets. He wore civilian clothes, a dark rain jacket, rubber boots, and a baseball cap pulled low. In his duffel bag, he carried a satellite phone, a trauma kit, a suppressed pistol, and the photographs of Anya's scars. He had memorized the coordinates. The island was a small dot on the map, uninhabited according to official records, privately owned by a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. The surgeon had chosen well. No one would look for screaming women on an island that did not officially exist. Leo's boat dropped him off to miles from the shore. James swam the rest of the way, towing a small waterproof bag. The water was warm, but his mind was cold. He thought about Anya, sitting alone in her hospital room, her back covered in a story no one should have to carry. He thought about the silver watch on her wrist, frozen at 3:17, the exact time he had deciphered her scars. Coincidence? He did not believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns. And the pattern of this surgeon was clear. He was a man who wanted to be caught, but only at the moment of his choosing. The watch was a countdown, a taunt, a game. James reached the island's rocky shore just before dawn. He crawled up a small beach, hidden by a fringe of mangroves, and observed. The island was small, maybe 2 miles across, with a single structure in the center, a 2-story concrete building painted a dull green. almost invisible against the jungle. There was a small dock on the eastern side, with a speedboat tied to it. No guards visible, no dogs. The surgeon was arrogant. He had been operating for years, and no one had ever come. Why would he need guards? James moved through the jungle like a shadow. The rain helped, masking the sound of his footsteps. He reached the edge of the clearing around the building and waited. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. The rain began to slow. And then, a door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, thin, with silver hair combed back from a high forehead. He wore a white linen shirt and khaki pants, despite the humidity. He looked like a retired professor, someone who might give lectures on Renaissance art or butterfly collecting. He walked to the dock, untied the speedboat, and began to check the fuel gauge. He was humming. James recognized the tune. It was a lullaby. A Russian lullaby about a little boy who gets lost in the woods. James's blood turned to ice. The man was not just a surgeon. He was Russian. And he had taken Anya, a Russian oligarch's daughter, not for ransom, but for something else. Something personal. James waited until the man turned his back to check the boat's engine. Then he moved, fast, silent. He crossed the clearing in 6 seconds, wrapped an arm around the man's throat, and applied just enough pressure to cut off blood flow to the brain. The man went limp in 3 seconds. James caught him, lowered him to the dock, and zip-tied his hands and feet. Then he dragged him into the bushes and gagged him with a strip of cloth. Inside the building, James found what he had come for. The ground floor was a clinic. Surgical tables, trays of instruments, for stands, monitors. The walls were covered in photographs. Dozens of them. Women of all ages, all nationalities. Some of them smiling in the photographs, some of them crying. The photographs were arranged in a timeline. James recognized Anya's face in several of them. She was younger, maybe 22, smiling in front of a yacht. The last photograph of her showed her lying on a surgical table, her eyes wide with terror, her back already marked with the first cuts, but the photographs were not the worst part. The worst part was the basement. James descended a narrow staircase, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was divided into small cells, each one with a metal door and a small window. He shone the light through the first window. A woman was curled on a thin mattress, her hair matted, her eyes closed. He moved to the second cell. Another woman. The third. The fourth. All alive. All unconscious or sedated. And all of them, as he discovered when he opened the first door and gently turned a woman onto her side, had scars on their backs. Different patterns. Different languages. Different maps. 7 women. Just as Anya's scars had said. James worked quickly. He had trained for this. He pulled out his trauma kit and began checking pulses, breathing, signs of infection. They were all severely malnourished and dehydrated, but they were alive. He injected each of them with a slow-acting reversal agent to counteract the sedatives. One by one, they began to stir. They were confused, frightened. Some of them screamed when they saw him. But James had brought photographs of Anya of Elena, and he showed them to the women. He pointed to the scars on her back in the photograph, then gestured to his own back, then to the door. A universal language. I am from her. I am here to take you out. The oldest woman, a gray-haired woman with deep scars that had healed years ago, looked at James with eyes that had seen too much. He will wake up, she whispered in English. He always wakes up. And he will come for us. No, James said. He won't. He left the women in the basement, locked from the outside to keep them safe, and went back to the dock. The surgeon was awake now, his eyes wild behind the gag, his body struggling against the zip ties.